Welcome back to the show. I'm B. Dougie, and you're about to learn the secret sauce. Perfect. So, Avi, thanks so much for making the drive over the bridge.
Thank you for having me. Very cool to be here.
Yeah. So, do you want to just let the audience know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name's Avi Press. I am a software engineer, developer tool author, and now the founder and CEO of Scarf.
I'm going to ask, what is Scarf? Because it sounds interesting. Actually, I know what it is, but I'd love the listeners to know.
Yeah. So Scarf is a platform for the distribution and analytics and commercialization for open source software. So we help open source projects get a better understanding of how their projects are being used, what impact it's having, what companies are using it, with the ultimate goal being to actually connect these projects to their end users so they can be successful, whatever that means to them.
Excellent. So I want to get into more of Scarf, but I actually want to get into how you got to where you are today.
Yeah.
So I don't know how far back. We were talking before we hit record that you live in my old neighborhood in Oakland, and you went to UC Berkeley. So we could start there. How did you get into starting your own company? What sort of steps you took?
Yeah. So after school, I was just very head over heels in love with programming generally, and so I.
Is that what you studied at school?
I did minor in computer science, but my major was actually cognitive science. So I was very into
brain.
Yeah,
okay.
basically modeling people's behavior mathematically and seeing how you can kind of inform AI models based on how people solve problems. Okay,
that seemed like a very valuable thing during the Cambridge Analytica days.
Yeah, it was super interesting topic of study, and I learned a lot of machine learning methods from it. Got very really honed my programming skills from doing that. But after school, I definitely wanted to see what being a professional software engineer was like.
Okay,
and so I right out of school went to Pandora and was working there for a few years. And I got to do a lot of very big data projects, which was super cool. So I got to build out their first concert recommendation engine, which was a very cool project to get to do. And
what year did you join Pandora?
I did an internship there in 2013, and then 2014 I started full time.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, good years. It's
a
very mature product at that point.
Yeah, it was still a mature. Yeah, it was a very mature product. I was really focused after that recommendation system was building a lot of tools that would help artists understand how their music was doing and connect with their fans more effectively and just run their business better. And
it seems very related to what you're doing now.
Exactly. So that was the start of me thinking about how better data sharing initiatives can help people, just can help solve problems by sharing data better. But I was also using a lot of open source. And there were times where, you'd hit a bug in some library, open up an issue on GitHub, and then you just kind of wait and hope that the issue gets solved. But in practice, you end up finding, some complicated workaround that the maintainer probably could have solved for you very quickly had you had a relationship with them. And so that was something that was on my mind, but ultimately I kind of tabled that line of thinking, but was really interested in startups. And so I joined some early stage companies as engineer number one. It's at a startup in the city. And there I started building a lot of developer tools that were really mostly just for me and for what became the engineering team at that company. And it got to the point where this employer was relying so heavily on my tools. I'm okay, I should open source these. They'll probably be useful outside of this team, and that turned out to be correct. And so there's an integration test framework, and then a code scanning thing, a project that managed the to-dos in your code base, basically, which is kind of niche, but enough people.
I've seen people build that. I've actually used. Actually, I think I have the to-do list GitHub app. Installed in open source actually today.
Got it. Yeah, so this was something for that problem, specifically geared for this company's particular issues. But it got to the point where my nights and weekends were just going to maintaining these things that people at big companies turned out to be using, and I would get an issue from someone who is at some big company saying hey, there's a memory leak in this server and it's really messing with us in these ways. And I'm an entrepreneurial person. That got me thinking if I'm providing value to a big company, I should maybe explore if I should start a business around some of these tools. But ultimately, I didn't really have any of the data to actually know if that was really a good idea. I was just kind of going off of a hunch on the momentum of my GitHub activity. Even if I knew there was a company on the other side, I didn't really, like, what would I do? Like, sell them a support contract maybe, if I'm lucky. Maybe I'll try to sell them a license for some other features, but like, how would I even
ask for a job, maybe?
Ask for a job, but that wasn't really my goal. So, what to do in that situation? And so I tried a bunch of things, but ultimately it was not a very successful endeavor to try to monetize these developer tools. And I was thinking really deeply about what the problems I was facing was, and there were two main things here. So one was that as a package author on package managers, I just had a download count. That's not useful enough. I need to know what companies are using. I need to know how they're using it, what versions, all these kinds of things. And then I also needed a way to actually deliver a paid product in the same distribution channel that I was giving people the software already, not something off to the side. And so I became obsessed with this. Like, I could not stop thinking about it. And so I wrote some blog posts. It turned out other people had this problem too. And then I got started on what became Scarf to really address this problem of observability and distribution of open source as a foundation for how can we more sustainably build businesses around open source. Yeah.
So like, I admit, I already got the connection from like Pandora, what you're working on there, but identifying like, sometimes it could be a little punk rock in open source where like you ship a thing, a tool or to-do app or whatever to make your life easier, then someone else picks it up and it's like, cool, here's a sticker. And like you feel good about open source, but then when it comes time for us to like grow up and like switch our leather jackets to like, maybe collared t-shirts. I'm still wearing graphic tees, but what I'm getting at is like you now need to figure out how to sustain your life and your lifestyle and maybe get money from this. So I can see where like the evolution of like open source to Scarf or Scarf Gateway, which we'll get there in a moment, but someone to say, I want to use this tool so I can just make a decision on like where my career or this roadmap is going towards.
Yeah, and just like understand the impact that your work has. I think that we put software out to the world for a variety of different reasons, but like when it becomes so much work that like a significant amount of your life is being spent on it, to actually be able to measure what's going on can be just so useful for a variety of reasons, business being just one of them.
Excellent. So you created Scarf. You get success eventually, but what'd you do after you created it? How'd you make it useful for developers?
Yeah, it was a series of just trial and error. So like the first thing that I built was a system package manager. And that package manager would basically install programs inside of this wrapper that could do, kind of basic analytics. But you could also say, if you want to use this package with no reporting whatsoever, here's how much it costs. Swipe the card and you can buy it. It was a very novel idea, very controversial idea, obviously.
It's like back in the day when I was doing in college, I was doing copy and pasting code. It was like shareware, I think. Was that the term where you could? It wasn't. That was probably open source. Sorry, my naivete is really showing. But you'd be able to use the free version, and then you pay for a license. And I think a lot of Adobe's products were like that early in the years.
And it's hard to do that from scratch even today. The tools are not really the barrier to entry to do that is actually quite high in practice, even for this thing that has been around for a really long time. And that's kind of part of the problem. There's a lot of these business models are really effective and good if you're Oracle or if you're this giant company that can absorb these massive operational costs. But if you're just Avi coding, at home, it's not. You don't have the accessibility to those kinds of business models really today, which is a shame.
Okay. Yeah. So this sort of pay to it sounds like you don't do that anymore.
No. Yeah. So that was a very novel idea. I got a lot of feedback from it, but ultimately it did not work. It was bad because package managers are really hard to build, and there was no to make a good production grade one that actually provided value to the end user, not just the maintainer. I needed to do so much more to actually make that compelling. And so obviously the form of analytics was also very aggressive as well. And people would say invasive, I'm sure. And so what ended up happening was I it seemed like we were trying to do too much all at once. And so I got to thinking, well, what's the smallest thing that I could build that would actually provide some value to developers? And eventually, I talked to so many developers, and I eventually had a conversation with Faraz, who you recently talked to. Yeah. And one of the things that was said was, I really just need to know what companies use this. And so I got to thinking, and I was like, I could write a very small JavaScript library that would solve that problem. And so I basically was just coding for like a week straight on this, put out Scarf.js into the world, and then what Scarf.js was, all it was, you just add the dependency to your package, like just one line in a package JSON. Anytime your package gets installed, Scarf gets installed, sends off a post install hook that just says, hey, here's the version of the package that was just installed. That's all it would do. Then we would do some IP lookups to tag it with a company, show that to you. That's it. And we got a couple large React projects to use it. So React Table was using it, React Query was using it, Final Form was using it, like some big libraries. Okay. Yeah. And so...
And I was going to say, two of those are the same person, Tanner, and then
Tanner
and
Lindsley.
then Eric, who I recently just talked to at Render ATL.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, yes. Small world. I definitely want to have them on eventually.
Yeah, they're great. I would recommend. And so, before long, this package has, quite a bit of downloads. And then it was time to raise some funding. And so from basically right as this was happening, we raised our first $2 million for Scarf, which was, I was over the moon about. But very quickly, the end user pushback started to happen about what it really boiled down to. It really erupted into this very large discussion in the Reactiflux Discord. Basically saying, when I type npm install, I do not expect data to be sent to some third party.
Yeah.
Fair. We were being very transparent about what was being sent. We'd print these giant console things to the console being like, here's what we're sending, here's how you see it, here's 3 different ways to opt out of it, and here's who's doing it. But it was about the violation of people's expectations was what.
Yeah, even if it was like I guess you did IP lookup, but with the world that we live in, GDPR, and also the California disclosure, you weren't storing private data or personal or PPI or anything like that.
No, we would get rid of all of the PII. We still do that. We scrub IPs from our system, so we can't leak them because we don't even have them.
Yeah.
We were doing all the right things, but it was about people's expectations, and us not falling into that was what ultimately made it unsuccessful in the long run. And so, from those discussions, even with people who were vehemently saying this is bad and you should not do this, they agreed that I see why maintainers need this data though. So how do we get it to them? Yeah. And so ultimately what came out of these discussions was, look, we have expectations for when data is collected about us and when it's not. If you can fit into those, great. But if you can't, then,
okay,
go away.
I'm on the edge of my seat. What was the resolution? What did you build to solve this problem?
The first thing that we built, one of the questions I asked was so how is what we're doing different than you going to a web page and there's tracking pixels?
Yeah.
And people said, yeah, I just expect that on a web page. Yeah. And we're okay, well, and then in 4 days I built documentation insights, which is tracking pixels for open source docs. Just throw a 1x1 clear pixel into your README. Now, if someone loads your docs, whether it's on Docker Hub or on NPM or in their editor, they load the image and we can show that to the developer so they can know what parts of the docs are getting looked at, what might be the most confusing, where in the world is my user base, what companies are looking at the docs, all these kinds of things. And so everyone who kind of moved away from Scarf.js based on the user feedback, they all are using documentation insights now.
Okay.
That was the first thing. So that was kind of addressing it. But then what really, kind of really got us going was then what became what is today known as Scarf Gateway, which is essentially just a redirect and proxy layer that sits in front of any package registry, any artifact registry. It just gives you a new stable URL. So say you publish binaries to GitHub releases. That URL is not yours, it's GitHub's.
Yeah.
And so we basically make it really easy to give you your URL that you can share with your users. We just redirect over to GitHub releases. So it doesn't change your publishing workflow or any of that. The only difference is now you have full visibility into that traffic.
Yeah.
we got very early traction with that for Docker containers because right around the time we were doing this, Docker Hub started announcing their rate limits for anonymous
What
free
year
accounts.
was that?
This was last November.
Okay, wow.
Oh, actually, no. It wasn't. Sorry, this was the November before. Yeah, a year. November of 2020.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, time is really flying by
In
these days.
this age, yes, it's a really weird time.
Yeah. And it had a lot of companies like wanting to switch off of Docker Hub somewhere else, but they couldn't because everyone is locked. Like everyone's, downloading the image directly, which is implicitly Docker Hub.
Yeah.
So there's this switching cost, and so had a lot of people wanting to move back and forth. And now we give you a nice stable URL that's yours. You can connect your own domain. And so if you don't even like Scarf at the end of the day, it's on your domain. You can do whatever you want with it. And that's really built into what we do. We don't want a lot. If you use Scarf, it should be because we're providing you a good product, not because you are locked into it and you can't leave it.
Yeah.
And I think a theme to what we do is making sure that our incentives align with maintainers' incentives.
Yeah, and that's honorable, but also makes sense because like you were trying to solve a problem for yourself, trying to solve a problem for Firas, and then you even took the time to listen to the end users who were just like, yeah, this is not cool. And I totally get that. I am definitely on the side of like, it wasn't really personal information, but I do get the expectations of like where most people think of open source and how you interact with node packages.
Yeah, I think I've learned that if people care enough about the problem to, be very, very critical of what you're doing on the internet, they're actually giving you some of the best feedback often.
Yeah.
And by kind of just struggling through uncomfortable conversations with them, you learn quite a lot.
Yeah.
And those conversations were brutal at the time to have. But I think it was really illuminating. And I think part of what Scarf is doing is kind of absorbing that social risk of trying things that may be very unpopular. Because ultimately, I think the open source community has not really reckoned with a lot of these like economic incentives that are in play here.
Yeah.
And someone's got to eventually be very explicit about them. And so we're kind of trying to be that agent to we'll try figure out what works with analytics and open source, something that has been traditionally very adamantly hated, and showing, look, there's actually really, really good value here, and it can be done properly.
Yeah, what do you think about taking a step away from this conversation for a sec, well, Scarf in particular, the broader conversation around open source and like this evolution that's happening. We're seeing more VC-backed companies that are solving problems in open source. We're also seeing like even more solutions that are even changing how we even think about open source. Like GitHub sponsors is one that comes to mind, but like Open Collective was before that, TiLift. Like we now think about how payments or how to even pay open source maintainers differently, where before it was like, this is the code that you wrote for me. Thank you so much. Here's a pat on the back or maybe a star.
Yeah.
And be on with the rest of your day. And good luck if I open up issues or even like contribute back. But now the mindset's shifting. At least the new wave of developers, like they're now expecting, I can actually contribute back. There's an approachability thing. So, like, do you think that you're shepherding a portion of that movement, but at the broader, do you think there's more folks who are now interested in open source and as an avenue to grow teams, company, culture, code? I definitely
think so. I think, a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, one aspect is just that the more we improve the open source sustainability story, the more inclusive open source can really be, because the reality is not everyone has the resources to work on stuff for free, especially for giant companies. And if you can enable people like that to build a sustainable business, then more people can then get into open source, which is great. And I think the other thing, especially with like the things like this observability and the data, the data side of this, is that we've seen kind of an increase in the appetite for commercializing as well when people actually realize the impact that they have. I love seeing people tweet like, oh my God, NASA is using my library, I had no idea. And like just seeing, even if you had no ambitions to build a large project or have this huge impact, you might realize that you've been having that much more than you thought. And so I get very excited about the notion that we could kind of inspire a whole new generation of entrepreneurship in the open source space. Ultimately, I think if you're building useful stuff, and especially if that useful stuff is contributing to a company's bottom line, you should be getting a cut of that, period.
Yeah.
And that's not where we are right now, but we might be soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. Like, I'm thinking of so I did this whole talk at, it's funny, I did a couple talks back to back. But recently I did a talk at the Nexus Conf, which is orbit.love.
Nice,
is their URL. They have a product, definitely leverage it, check it out. But I spoke at the conference about growing open source community and how there's like a system that you could sort of plug yourself into. And I made the analogy of like the system in the NBA. So like the minimum salary for the NBA, you know the minimum salary? For
I don't know, I have no idea.
It's $925,000. So just as one small 12th man on the team, so you're not starting, you probably don't even like take off your warm-up suit to even play during the game, but you're just like on the end of the bench, $925,000. So like your impact is definitely worth it because when you're practicing, like you're giving everybody a good look. Maybe you get put in if like the team's getting squashed or whatever, but like you're on the team.
Right.
So when it comes to like everybody who's on that bench, including assistant coaches, everybody's getting a piece of the pie, whether it's a super small piece or whatever. So what I'm getting at with open source is like you can make yourself like valuable in a release. Are you like the thing that I see all the time, like React has said React 18 and Vue had Vue 3. There's always a tweet. It's like, hey, try it out in your company project and give us feedback. And like majority, it's like crickets. You would think for such a popular project, you'd get I just tapped the mic, but anyway, for such a popular project, you'd get way more feedback and way more interaction from folks, but it's not always the case.
Yeah, good feedback's really hard to get.
So it's like even like, I don't know if this is something you're even paying attention to as like a persona or something to look at, but like identifying people using your project and then saying, hey, we would love to have like a inner circle or a MVP program or most valuable free customers to be able to say, hey, I just want my release to get used before it goes live so that way we don't have complaints.
That's super valuable. Yeah. And I think that one of the things when it comes to like open source community building generally is that there's a huge like squeaky wheel effect where just the people who are really loud get, they have tremendous sway over a project direction when in practice that I think is often very, very suboptimal for the project. There's so many people who just use open source quietly. They're just coding on their laptop and they download some random tool and they use it and they never interact with the project because they might not need to. Like the tool might just do what they need. And so I think, when we constrain the way we think about the community as just the people who are like directly engaging, you're probably only getting the very, very tip of the iceberg. And I think that if we empower maintainers to have a better understanding of that user base, you can get, you get maintainers that can be more effective with their time. They can more adequately, address their user base's needs. And, ultimately that means that they can be less burned out because they can work more efficiently.
Well, it's like Facebook does it with retargeting and ads and Google AdSense. It's whatever you've seen last is usually the thing you purchase. Right. So like you validate yourself by just. Actually, are you wearing Allbirds?
No, I'm not. These are Adams.
Adams, okay. So, sorry, I was going to say like Allbirds. Like I had a moment where on Instagram, every ad I had was Allbirds. So like, I should probably try this shoe. And like it's so many different things. Like everybody's wearing the same weird TikTok leggings. Yep. Because it's in your face. And you're like, oh yeah, this is what I should be wearing.
These effects are really huge, and it's the same in like the music space too. Like pretty much people want to listen to the same 100 songs, and the more you hear it, the more you like it until you get tired of it.
Are you a TikTok user?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny because how many songs I don't know, but I know.
Yeah.
Because I hear the 7 seconds, and I'm like, no. Oh, there's a whole song after this.
Yeah, and then you hear it on the radio, and you're like, what came first? I don't really know what got.
And it's amazing how it's just like you got to do stuff too. And we were talking about before we hit record about marketing and stuff that we do to engage community and stuff like that and the experiments you've been doing. But like it comes down to like knowing the knowledge, the data is powerful too as well. But like once you have that data, then you have to sort of have action.
Oh yeah, that's just the beginning. Like just understanding who is there is just the very start.
So I mean, understanding who is there, which is I think Scarf's your competitive edge, like being able to know that. So I don't know if we actually even touched a bit on the gateway. Can you explain like what Scarf Gateway, like what people are using today? What are the heavy hits?
Yeah. So with Scarf Gateway, again, we can make it so that instead of say, Docker pull, gcr.io/image, it's Docker pull yourdomain.com/yourimage. And as soon as that pull goes through, you'll know where in the world it came from, what version was downloaded, what runtime was being used, what company they worked at, all these kinds of things that can be very, very useful and actionable.
Yeah.
And especially if you're building a business, to know this company just tried it for the first time on Monday, and you know who to get in touch with by Friday.
It's almost like and forgive me if this is like too contrived example, but like kind of like the bit.ly links for.
Yeah. I think you're not, and that's an often made analogy that it's very much like link shortening, but specifically in the package management context or the artifact downloading context, but just for open source, that it plays nice with the existing tools, and ultimately gives open source maintainers more control over their distribution.
Yeah. That is genius, and. And it sounds like a lot of. So are companies they're open arms now with Scarf as well, or are you really focused on the maintainer experience at the moment?
We're addressing both, I would say. So there's definitely a lot of companies that are using Scarf. There's just straight like open source organizations. So we're getting adopted by more like Apache projects, Linux Foundation projects, from the various. Foundations, and then just indie maintainers as well. And I think, our paid offerings are much more geared towards these startups and commercial open source businesses. But it's really, really essential that we just become kind of the ubiquitous way to do this kind of thing in the open source space. And that, of course, involves the indie maintainers. Yeah,
and I have to ask too as well. So like, you originally started Scarf.js to solve like Feroz's problem. Anybody who's watching this right now, if you haven't watched Feroz's episode, which I believe is episode 1, definitely check it out.
It's very good.
Yeah, and but have you talked to Feroz? Have you solved his problem to date?
Yeah, it's funny because by the time like we got around to doing it, I think like he was working on 10 other things, and it didn't end up actually being something that he ever used, which is kind of funny. But I think that in terms of, I just want to know what companies use my open source software. We are the way to do that today. I think, not just who's statically depending on it in their code, but who's actually downloading it on their laptops today.
It sounds like a super valuable integration partnership, even with GitHub or Tidelift or Open Collective. Because then you could then have the sort of gateway to say, okay, here's who's using it. Here's what I could do, like a sort of campaign to say, hey,
exactly,
give us feedback, and then maybe we can invoice you.
Yeah, I mean, people even use Scarf to say like, oh, Uber's using this package. Hey, Uber on Twitter, like tweet, Uber, you should sponsor me, and that has worked for a handful of developers already.
Yeah.
Just call them out publicly, saying, I see you use this. You should fund or support the project.
And the thing is, like, no one knows until they ask. And if, like, you're able, because I've been at large companies like GitHub and other companies where we make decisions to go sponsor projects. So, like, one of the bigger ones that we did at Netlify when I was there was Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt was how we powered all auto-generated SSL.
That too, with Let's Encrypt.
Yeah, and so like Netlify made they basically just went out and sponsored Let's Encrypt directly.
Great.
But yeah, that sponsorship with Let's Encrypt, like it started like a whole movement around people who were benefiting from sort of the unseen. It's funny because I did like this sort of behind the scenes. We did some triaging for open source projects that are depended by tons of people, but never don't get a lot of popularity. So curl is one that comes up.
Curl is
it's like the premier like sort of feature complete project that only has one person keep the lights on. And Daniel Stenberg was actually part of that article series, and we had other people. But honestly, I need to connect you with the people at GitHub because like you probably have a follow up story.
Would definitely like to do that. Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, and I see so much potential, and I'm excited for the future of Scarf. I talked to like what we're working on open source. Like it's a bit different angle where it's more about Git commits,
right,
as opposed to actual packages. But there's an opportunity there. Yeah,
this is a very, very big space. You know,
yeah.
I think like there's. That's why conversations like this, I think, are very important, because like we all need to figure out ways to work together to make this stuff very effective. And so, yeah, like we're not really tackling the Git commits in the community, that side of things, and that's not what we want to focus on, because other people are doing it very well. So, it's such a big space that I think the way that businesses in open source succeed will be very similar to how open source itself has been successful. It's just like a very pure form of collaboration, and that's how we'll continue to improve as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I look forward to future collaborations with you. Appreciate you coming out and having this conversation.
Thanks
with me.
so much. Yeah.
And folks, stay saucy.